First of all, thanks so much for joining me on this. We're particularly grateful that you're willing to give us some time and attention to the product that we're developing. Hopefully it'll be something that will serve your needs as well as the needs of others. So the site that we're developing is called Argutopia, and the whole idea for this began probably about 10 years ago with me. But in reality, I guess it began a long time ago, because I started thinking about this question, which is, what has kept debate-centered instruction from being widely adopted as a pedagogy? And this question has been one that's kind of been present in my career throughout the entirety of it. When I learned about debate, I was a sophomore in college and didn't really have any academic direction whatsoever. Grew up in a really small town in South Dakota, had very little academic challenge, was in college only because I didn't have anything else to do, and had the good fortune to stumble into a debate class in my sophomore year, and knew after my very first debate that it's what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. And so I'm lucky, one of those lucky people, to have found my purpose and passion early in life and have kept doing it since. But I've always kind of been confused, since I gained so much from learning to debate, and particularly gained the entire foundation of my intellectual life is rooted in what I learned in debate. And it always was kind of curious to me that debate didn't gain more traction as a widely available, widely applied pedagogy. Certainly there were debate classes, communication departments, or language arts disciplines had debate and argumentation classes, but it seemed to me that learning to debate was more powerful than just something that you took a single class in. It seemed to me that it should be something that all students were doing to encounter all content areas in all subjects that they were studying. And I don't think that's really beyond the pale, because as far back as, 450 BC, we were using the Socratic dialogues to get into subjects and to encounter subjects. And so the notion of making students argue in order to understand ideas better has been around for a very, very long time. Why is it then that we don't use it more regularly in everyday classrooms? Why is it that we've defaulted to things like simple presentations that students make, or 5-paragraph essays that they write? So when thinking about this question, it seemed to me that there were kind of three major problems. And in the discussions that I'd had with teachers, because I started doing a lot of teacher trainings, in the discussions that I had with teachers, there were kind of three big problems that they identified. The first is, I kept hearing that debate is too difficult, too complex, too abstract, too unpredictable. And this kind of manifested in a couple of different ways. In the first way, it manifested in teachers being unsure of how to schedule a debate, how to make a debate work in their classroom, like what was necessary to have an effective and productive debate. But it was also for the students as well, because they were uncertain about how to debate effectively, what it was they were supposed to be doing, how they were supposed to argue, in particular how they were supposed to engage the arguments of the other side. And that lack of certainty, that lack of clarity, and that lack of concreteness ended up producing lots of debates that weren't particularly good, at least as reported to me when I was talking to teachers. They would say, I tried this, it didn't work out, my students didn't know what they were supposed to do, I didn't feel like it was productive at all, and so I've abandoned it. So that was one of the first problems. The second problem that I kept hearing about is that debates were difficult to manage in a classroom because they really concentrate only on the people who are actually doing the debate. And so despite the fact that every student in a class might get to participate in a debate over a period of time and through a series of debates that are scheduled, that in the moment when people are arguing, it seems that only the students who are making the arguments or engaged in the debate are really getting much out of it. Even when you ask audience members to reflect upon the debate, perhaps even to make a decision in the debate and to rationalize their decision, the vast majority of them, untrained in how to evaluate the exchange of arguments, are likely to default to articulating the winner of the debate as the side that most closely aligns with their position. And this is actually borne out in a lot of research that demonstrates that the arguments that are exchanged in these debate settings really only are interpreted by audiences in ways that confirm their pre-existing beliefs. That's obviously problematic, because it doesn't do much to inspire critical thinking if all you're doing is paying attention to and embracing the arguments that you already agree with. One of the third major problems then that I kept hearing about was that debates take up valuable time in a classroom. That if you're talking with an instructor who is teaching a course in biology or teaching a course in mathematics, or teaching a course even in governance. They've got a whole content, a set of content that they need to get through, that they want to convey to their students. And if you tell them, well, you should use a debate in your classroom, and then you start explaining that each debate might take somewhere between 20 minutes to an hour, and they start counting the number of students in their classroom, it becomes quickly evident they have to devote a significant amount of time just to get through one cycle of debates. So these three problems kind of have inspired what we're designing with Argutopia. We're trying to address all of these issues in a way that encourages teachers to embrace this pedagogy so that any class and any teacher, regardless of their exposure to debate, could embrace debate as a means to convey their content. They could do it as a simple one-off assignment in a host of other assignments for a class, or they could use this as the basis for an entire class, perhaps it's dedicated exclusively to debate. But we think that the site that we're building will help make that more accessible for teachers across the board. The key feature of the site is built on some research that I've been working on for a number of years that I was inspired to investigate because I started noticing pretty early in my career that there were some typical metaphors that we use to talk about argumentation and to talk about debate that kind of come up again and again. And these metaphors are linguistic metaphors. Obviously, they're the language that we use to explain what it is we're doing. But they kind of fall broadly into these two categories of space and force. And I used to talk about them as being metaphors of movement in debate, but I then realized that you could actually separate them out. The broad category of movement kind of shakes out into two subcategories, one of space and one of force. So some of the examples are things like debaters that, or arguers that take positions and identify points of clash, frame controversies, seek acceptable grounds, define boundaries of conflicts. But with regard to talking about force, we talk about moving audiences and advancing positions and backpedaling when we're arguing or engaging in strategic maneuvering or following lines of logic. And as you start to pay attention to this these metaphors, you start to understand that space and force are pretty prevalent in how we talk about argumentation. Matter of fact, I would venture to say that it's difficult to find a metaphor that we use to talk about argumentation that doesn't somehow connect to space and force. So this led me to do some investigation as to the relationship between spatial reasoning and abstract reasoning, wondering if there wasn't some connection between how we engage in abstract thought, that is the connection of ideas to one another, that doesn't in some way parallel how we engage in spatial thinking. And it's at this point that I came across a book by Steven Pinker called How the Mind Works, and was reading through this book and encountered a section in there in which he talks about this very thing. Steven Pinker's an evolutionary psychologist who talks about why we think because of the way that we have evolved. And his basic argument is that abstract thinking, abstract cognition, is not different from spatial cognition. As a matter of fact, what he claims is that we first developed spatial cognition as creatures, and this makes sense because in order to survive in the world you need to know things like where the threat is, or where the food is, or where the sexual partners are, right? Understanding space around you and how to move toward or away from those things that are desirable or threatening is a large part of evolutionary success. His claim is that as we advanced as a species, we effectively co-opted these means of spatial reasoning and started to apply them to abstract thought. So what originally was done to help us interpret the physical world around us began increasingly to be used by human beings as they evolved to understand the space in their mind, right? The reality and meaning that they constructed for that world around them. And this quote from Pinker, I think, really captures that. He says, models of space and force don't act like figures of speech intended to convey new insights. They seem closer to the medium of thought itself. So his entire thesis in this section of the book is that when we're thinking, we're engaging in at least something that is very closely related to spatial reasoning, if not effectively the same thing as spatial reasoning, despite the fact that we tend to call it abstract reasoning. So when you start thinking about this in terms of logic, you actually find a lot of relationships between spatial reasoning and abstract reasoning. So if you're talking about the means by which we engage in abstract reasoning, you're fundamentally talking about logic, and logic is, at its essence, the relationship between ideas. And as you start looking around at those things that we use to express the relationship between ideas, you start to notice that there's a lot of logic that is already embedded in spatiality. One of the simplest examples is how outlines are used to demonstrate the spatiality of logic. So outlines work by communicating superiority of ideas, by putting them above and to the left of other ideas. Those ideas that are below and indented are subordinate to those major ideas, and other ideas are placed in a coordinate relationship to those ideas with which they share similar focus and importance. So the simple outline uses this principle of spatiality to embed the logic of the relationship between ideas. The same is true of argument maps. We often use argument maps to illustrate to debaters how arguments work. So we identify claims as the superior idea of an argument, the goal of that argument. We talk about reasons as being supportive of claims, but they're always placed in a subordinate position to those claims. And ultimately, we talk about evidence as being a foundation for the reasons that we offer. So that spatiality even shows up there again in how we think about the relationship between ideas and argument. But Pinker illustrates yet another example where he talks about transitivity, one of the basic logical properties of transitivity. And he says that, look, if you have an arrangement whereby A is to the left of B and B is to the left of C, then you can be absolutely certain that because of this property of transitivity, that A will be to the left of C. So he talks about how the arrangement of things in physical space, literally from left to right, also communicates the relationship between them, and in this case the logical relationship between them in terms of transitivity. And then one really familiar example that a lot of people would understand is a Venn diagram, which demonstrates shared properties between two different sets and how those shared properties overlap between two different circles. And we constantly encounter these notions of overlapping and shared characteristics between sets that are communicated through Venn diagrams. The point of all this is to say that there is not only, I think, a credible argument that there's a relationship between spatial and abstract reasoning, but perhaps more importantly, that we can leverage that relationship to demonstrate to students and teachers particularly how debate works. If we can illustrate with a functional model, a visual model of debate, then we can perhaps more effectively, efficiently, and precisely clarify what debate is supposed to do. So I started thinking about the spatiality of debating. In other words, what it is we do in debate, and whether or not we could align the basic operations and functions of a debate along spatial terms. And so I started with the notion of whether or not there's a use for understanding the space of debate or the territory of argumentation. And it seems to me that one of the very first things that debaters need to know is how to define the ground of the debate. What are we going to debate about? What do the particular words mean? And through the definition of those words and the establishment of meaning, we come to a shared understanding with the opponents with whom we're debating about what it is we're disagreeing about. So defining ground certainly can be thought of as establishing the territory of argument. But also identifying clash can be an important part of space, knowing where arguments align with each other. And by the way, one of the favorite metaphors that pops up when talking about debating is to complain about the absence of clash in a debate as being two ships passing in the night, right? So there's another spatial metaphor that expresses what happens when debate goes wrong, that arguments don't interact well with one another, and consequently the debate is less productive than it should be. So being able to identify these points of clash, or to accurately predict and illustrate where arguments are interacting. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, sorry, I thought you were asking a question. So, space both defines ground and identifies clash. That's some of the fundamental things a debater has to do. But then there's also the force dimension of these metaphors, talking about how the energy of argumentation is applied in a debate round. So we've identified the space both by defining the ground and identifying the clash, but what do we do once we have those spaces defined within that territory? What operations do we undertake? Well, we engage in constructing arguments, that is, building arguments in such a way that they occupy space and that they establish and hold space in the mind of an audience. We engage in the deconstruction of arguments, that is, the engagement of an opponent's arguments, demonstrating the weaknesses and shortcomings, and ultimately trying to demonstrate to the audience why your arguments are preferable. And we engage in the comparison of arguments, why your arguments are preferable to theirs, and ultimately why the arguments that you're winning are more important perhaps than the arguments that your opponent might be winning. So all of this foundation, all of this thinking led me to develop a model of debating that I use and I have used now for many years to represent to teachers and students what they should do when they engage in a debate. And so this model starts with a discussion of the space of debate, the territory of controversy, which simply says that when you encounter a topic to debate and agree upon the definitions for that topic, you're effectively defining boundaries around the subject that you're going to disagree about. That subject, effectively, is a contest for the acceptance of the audience. So what you want to achieve is the audience to accept your arguments more than they accept your opponent's arguments. So you layer on that the division of that ground between pro and con, and you start to understand that the objective of the pro side is to advance that vertical line as far to the right as possible, and the objective of the con side is to advance that vertical line to the left as far as possible. So we know that any territory of controversy, any space within which debate can occur, is going to be ideally divided between pro and con before the debate begins, and the efforts of the pro and con are going to be to advance that line to the left or right to gain that acceptance of the audience. But we can also think of that space as being subdivided into issues. And those issues are those more narrow points of clash that express the interaction between pro and con arguments. So any broad topic is going to have several different places where arguments interact between pro and con. And that space then better defines the interaction between those arguments, making it easier for the debaters to prepare for the debate, as well as easier for the audience to track and follow the debate, to understand what interactions are occurring. So if, for example, we're debating a topic like tobacco products should be banned, we might anticipate that there's going to be disagreement between the pro and the con, not just on the general topic, but on more specific articulations of issues that emerge from the debate and from that topic. Things like whether tobacco use poses a public health risk, whether a ban on tobacco use would cause economic hardships, or whether a ban would violate tobacco users' rights. But I mentioned too that in addition to space, there's this notion of force in argumentation, how the energy of controversy plays out through the arguments that debaters exchange. And broadly speaking, we can talk about the force exerted within that territory on two axes. The first is the axis of preference, which suggests that the audience might prefer the pro side's arguments or the con side's arguments, either in general or within a particular issue. But there's also the axis of significance, which allows the audience to determine which of the issues being contested are more relevant to the decision that they're making. Some issues are more important than others when an audience makes a decision in a debate. So given that then, and recalling that discussion of the three moves, broad moves in debate, construction, deconstruction, and comparison, we can talk about two different applications of energy along each of those axes. So for example, we talk about distribution, which is the allocation of territory within issues based upon the arguments that the debaters make. So as the debaters introduce arguments constructively and engage the other side's arguments deconstructively, the audience's perception of who's occupying more space might ultimately begin to shift and change based upon that application of energy or the arguments that they're interpreting. Similarly, we can talk about the displacement between issues, where as one issue grows in importance, other issues recede in importance. And again, this is due to the arguments that the debaters make. Successful debaters know that they have to compare the arguments they're winning to the arguments that the other side is winning. And ideally, if they do so, as their arguments grow in significance, their opponent's arguments retreat in significance. So that if you go back to this pre-debate model, where you predict that there's going to be argumentation both on the broad topic, but also focused on three issues that emerge from that broad topic, if the model looks like this before the debate begins, then after the arguments have been exchanged and the audience has allocated the model accordingly based upon their perception of those arguments, it might go from looking like this to looking like something like this. Or at the end of the debate, the model is appropriately allocated based upon the audience's perception, the arguments are recorded in their respective spaces, and a simple glance at this model can tell the whole story of the debate. What happened here, first of all, it's obvious that the proposition side won the debate, the pro side won this debate, because they occupy more acceptance, more territory in the mind of the audience than does the con side. But the model also tells a story of how they won. They won by convincing the audience that tobacco poses a significant public health risk. The vertical line dividing pro from con in that first issue is moved all the way to the right, which obviously suggests the audience preferred the pro arguments to the con. And the first issue was seen as by the audience as being more significant than the other two issues. So public health risk was a bigger factor in their decision about banning tobacco than whether that ban would cause economic hardship, or violate users' rights. I use this model for a couple of purposes, and what we're intending to do with Argutopia is to take this model from just this sort of static representation. I mean, I literally have students draw these models with a pencil and a piece of paper to illustrate how the debate unfolded. But I've always wanted a dynamic model that was based in a digital medium that students could manipulate and work with as the debate is unfolding. So much of Argutopia is built around this manipulable model, a version of this model that I've just showed you that students can interact with and actually use to track and watch the debate. And I think it has utility in three different areas. Before the debate begins, I think the model can help debaters plan for their arguments by offering them a blueprint of what the debate is going to be like, how it's going to unfold, what arguments they can expect from their opponents, what positions they need to prepare for, etc. I think during the debate, the model is useful if it's provided to an audience because it can scaffold their attention, can provide them a framework to follow the debate, to understand the arguments being exchanged, and to track how they feel about and interpret the arguments that the debaters are making. And after the debate, I think the model has real utility for allowing an audience to deliberate about who won and lost, because it allows them to quickly and effectively communicate why they arrived at the decision they arrived at by showing their version of the model and comparing it to other students' versions of the model. And in that comparison, I think they spawn discussion about which arguments they preferred and which arguments they interpreted, why arguments were stronger than others, and more importantly, it focuses and provides them that framework to articulate the reasons more clearly. All of that then leads to a discussion of the site that we're planning to build. The Argutopia site is going to have three areas. The first is going to be an education center, and here we'll have what we call debate kits. Debate kits are just simply topics and pre-designated issues that teachers can work with. Some of these will be provided by us, so they could select amongst debate kits that are prepared for them. But we're also going to have a social dimension to the site where we encourage teachers to develop their own topics and the issues that are accompanying them and make them available to other teachers so that they can plug them right into the model on the site, distribute it to their students, and get to work on a debate quickly by having the students understand what arguments are going to be exchanged in that particular debate. It's also, of course, going to be a utility section of the site where we manage accounts, manage classroom settings, and those sorts of things. But the main part of the site is going to be what we're calling the debate workshop, and that has 5 different elements to it. So in part, there'll be a debate designer, which allows instructors to either adopt standard formats for debate or to build their own format that works for the constraints of their class. So they could build a 1 versus 1 debate, a 2 versus 2 debate, 3 versus 3, or so on. They could have multiple speeches from students or 1 speech per student. They could have cross-examination periods or discussion periods. We'll give them lots of tools to build out the type of format that works with them and a lot of guidance about what makes for an effective format for debate. There's also going to be a scheduling tool built into the site, and the scheduling tool does a couple of things. Minimally, it's going to provide an instructor the ability to automatically schedule students into debates in their class, which means that with a push of a button, they can pair students into groupings, assign them pro and con responsibilities, perhaps even assign them adjudication responsibilities for the debates that they're going to watch. Or they can manipulate that in a manual fashion so that they can use the framework of the site to put particular students into groupings that they prefer perhaps more skilled students with others, more skilled students with novice students, etc. We also imagine eventually to build out the site such that you could use the site to engage in intrascholastic or interscholastic matches. So you could put out challenges to other classes within your school. You could put out challenges to other schools within your district, or for that matter, you could put out challenges across the nation, saying, hey, we're studying this curriculum, we're planning a debate on this subject, would your class like to engage in a debate with our class? And we'll have both live opportunities to interact on the site, so a synchronous video conference debate, or the ability to do asynchronous video, which kind of leads to, well, I'll talk about that more in a second when I talk about the debate studio. But all of this is grounded in that debate modeler. So this is the dynamic version of that model that I was talking about, that's editable by debaters, so they can add arguments when they're planning out their debate. They can anticipate the other side's arguments if they'd like. The teacher or the instructor can provide them with that information before the debate begins, so they know what issues are going to be present there, and then provide that to the audience during the debate so they can follow along and track the debater's arguments. The audience would be able to enter their own arguments or understanding of the arguments onto that model and effectively use it as a flow or a set of notes for the debate that they're watching. The debate studio is where we imagine those live, synchronous video conference debates happening, or, if the teacher would prefer, using a threaded video approach, something similar to Flipgrid, where students would be given, say, a week to compile a debate outside of class. So imagine you assign 4 debaters, 2 pro and 2 con, and you say to them, you're going to have a week to complete this debate. You assign it on Monday. The first speech is recorded on Tuesday. The next speaker has 24 hours to think about, plan, and respond. They record their debate on Wednesday. The second pro speaker on Thursday, the second con speaker on Friday, and over the course of a week, outside of class at the student's convenience and with plenty of preparation time, they've recorded an entire debate on the site that an audience can then review and react to, providing adjudication and rationale for that debate that they've observed. And finally, we'll have assessment tools for debate as well. We imagine a couple of things. At the most minimal level, we think we'll provide rubrics for teachers to use to evaluate the arguments in the debates that they're watching. But we're eventually planning for things like time-stamped comments on the videos that students record for the debates. And so imagine watching a debate and being able to enter at the moment of the video that you're watching a comment about how the student might improve their performance or improve the argument that they're making. So all of this is currently in production right now. We're working with a user experience design firm to create what's called, in the industry, it's called an MVP, a minimum viable product. Our plan is to have this available by the fall semester. And so it's minimally going to have these elements: a course management element that allows people to roster their classes, put together assignments, and design formats for the debate. It'll certainly feature a version of the debate modeler, which will include access to debate kits with topics and issues. Those can be customized, they can be shared socially on the social dimension of the site. And of course, those will always be available before, during, and after the debate. It's kind of the entire focus of the debate, or of the site. And then we're also planning to build out a section that encourages audience deliberation. And this is part of what I think is most useful about debate as a pedagogy, is it benefits those students who are engaged in making the arguments, but it also has great utility for those who are watching the arguments if their contemplation of the debate they watch is properly structured. One of the things that I found as a coach and a teacher is that I've learned a lot more about debate from watching and judging debates. And I've incorporated that into my teaching about debate and my coaching about debate, because if in any coaching or classroom setting I have students who aren't actively debating, they're always required to watch the round and to judge the round to come up with a rationale for the decision that they've made. And I find that to be a really powerful experience in terms of developing that sort of metacognitive reflectivity that encourages students to think about how they're thinking about argumentation. So imagine after a debate, you've got a group of 3 or 4 students. Each of them has a differently configured model based upon their interpretation of the debate. On the site, they'll be able to share out those models with one another. They'll be able to see a mean result for their model, so that the process of averaging their different allocations of the model would be automated. but then they would also have one main collaborative model that they could work on together to reach consensus about what the outcome of the debate was, making arguments and evaluating the other's positions about why they think one debate or one side was stronger than the other. As I mentioned, in the future, we're planning for things like interscholastic and intrascholastic scheduling, providing the opportunity for teachers to challenge other classes to debates, those synchronous and asynchronous video-based debates, timestamp feedback on student speeches, and a whole bunch of the other material that I've incorporated there. But that's the basic approach that we're taking with the site. What we're hoping for on Thursday and Friday is to get a number of teachers who, familiar with this sort of overview, would be willing to give us feedback on how the designs are progressing so far.